Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling a pretty powerful substance, ephedrine. When I hear that word, I think energy supplements, athletes trying to get a boost, but it's obviously more complicated than that. If you are interested in more topics like this, you can visit our website, publichealthlaw.net.
Right, it's definitely got that reputation. But, ephedrine's been around for a long time, and its history goes way beyond the gym or those questionable diet pills.
Okay, so let's back up a bit then. What exactly is ephedrine? Where does it come from?
So basically, we're talking about a medication derived from the ephedra plant. You might heard it called ma huang. It's been used in traditional Chinese medicine for centuries.
Centuries, wow. So it must have some real effects if people have been using it that long.
It does. Even in small doses, ephedrine can have a pretty significant impact on the body. It all boils down to how it interacts with your nervous system.
Okay, so maybe not just some harmless herb then.
Oh.
What's going on there?
Well, imagine your body suddenly in that fight or flight mode. Heart's racing, senses are heightened, you're ready for action. That's your sympathetic nervous system kicking in.
I'm with you. Adrenaline rush, right?
Exactly. And ephedrine essentially mimics that response.
So it kind of tricks your body into thinking it's in an emergency situation.
In a way, yes. It targets these specific receptors on your cells called alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. Think of them like little docking stations.
Docking stations for what?
For chemicals that trigger responses in your body. When ephedrine binds to these receptors, it sets off a chain reaction.
Interesting. What kind of chain reaction are we talking about?
Well, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure goes up, and your airways open up. That's called bronchodilation.
So that's why it's used to treat asthma.
Mm.
Makes sense. Opening up the airways would help with breathing difficulties.
Precisely. That's one of the main medical uses for ephedrine, especially for those acute asthma attacks where someone needs really quick relief.
Makes sense. So you've got this substance derived from a plant that's been used for a long time. It can mimic the body's stress response, and it's useful for treating asthma. But something tells me there's more to the story, right?
There is. Ephedrine is powerful stuff. While it has its place in medicine, it also has the potential for misuse and some pretty serious side effects. That's why it's so tightly regulated, especially here in the U.S.
Yeah, that's my next question. If it's so effective for asthma, why isn't ephedrine more readily available? Like, why all the caution?
Well, remember how we talked about ephedrine mimicking that fight or flight response?
Yeah, the adrenaline rush.
Right. Well, if you take too much ephedrine, even just a little too much, it can send your heart racing dangerously fast. That can lead to arrhythmias, or even worse, a hypertensive crisis.
A hypertensive crisis. What's that?
Basically, it means your blood pressure spikes way too high, and that can be life-threatening. Could even lead to a stroke.
Okay, now I'm seeing why there's so much concern. So who should absolutely not use ephedrine? Like, are there any red flags people should watch out for?
Definitely. If you have a history of heart problems, any thyroid issues, glaucoma, or even certain psychiatric disorders, ephedrine is a no-go. And honestly, that's not even an exhaustive list.
So anyone with those conditions should talk to their doctor before even considering ephedrine.
Absolutely. And the same goes for anyone with a history of drug abuse or if they've had a bad reaction to similar medications. It's not something to mess around with.
Makes sense.
No.
Now, given how potent ephedrine is, I imagine it could interact with other medications too. Are there any combinations that are particularly dangerous?
Oh, absolutely. You're right to be concerned about that. Some interactions can be really risky. Like one particularly dangerous combination is ephedrine with MAO inhibitors. That's a type of antidepressant.
Oh, wow. What happens if you mix those?
Well, taking both together could lead to that hypertensive crisis we were just talking about, that sudden dangerous spike in blood pressure.
So definitely not a good idea. Anything else people should be aware of?
Yeah, another thing to keep in mind is if you're taking beta blockers, those are often prescribed for heart conditions.
Right. Well, ephedrine might not work as effectively if you're on beta blockers. They can actually kind of counteract each other.
So it's like those commercials, right? Talk to your doctor to see if medication is right for you.
Exactly.
Yep.
You've got to be aware of all your medications and how they might interact. Even something that seems natural because it comes from a plant can still have serious consequences.
Good reminder. It's all about managing risk, like you said. Now, we were talking about who shouldn't use ephedrine. Are there any groups that need to be extra cautious, even if they don't have those specific conditions we mentioned?
Yeah, there are definitely some folks who need to be really careful. Pregnant women, for one.
Right, of course. Makes sense.
And nursing mothers, the elderly.
Yeah, those are all groups that are more sensitive to medications in general.
Exactly. And children, too.
Kids, too. Wow.
Ephedrine can really mess with fluid balance, blood pressure, and the nervous system, and those effects can be more intense in these groups.
Yeah.
Could lead to some serious complications. Okay, so it's all about understanding your own body and how it might react, basically.
Right, and not taking any unnecessary risks. Now, let's say someone tries ephedrine and it doesn't work for them, or maybe their doctor advises against it. Are there good alternatives out there?
Yeah, that's a good question. What if ephedrine's not an option?
Well, the good news is, yes, there are alternatives. There are other medications that can be used to treat things like asthma and low blood pressure,
Like what?
pseudoephedrine, for example,
Yeah.
and phenylephrine. You've probably seen those names on over-the-counter medications.
Oh, yeah, I think I have.
They can be pretty effective for some people.
But I imagine even with those alternatives, talking to a healthcare provider is still the best first step.
Oh, absolutely. They can help figure out what's safest and most effective for your specific needs.
Personalized medicine, right?
Exactly. Now, earlier we touched on ephedrine's, shall we say, colorful past, particularly its use in diet supplements and performance enhancers.
Right. That whole quick fix idea.
Yeah, ephedrine was pretty popular in weight loss products for a while because it can suppress appetite and rev up your metabolism.
And I guess for athletes, that energy boost was pretty appealing.
Exactly. It was marketed as this miracle solution for weight loss and enhanced performance. But of course, there was a downside.
I bet.
As we've discussed, ephedrine can have some pretty nasty side effects, especially when it's not taken under medical supervision or in high doses.
Yeah, I remember hearing stories about people having heart problems after taking those ephedrine supplements. Scary stuff.
Definitely. And that's a big part of why the FDA cracked down on ephedrine. They were getting more and more concerned about the widespread misuse and the potential for harm.
So what did they do?
Ultimately, they banned the sale of dietary supplements that contained ephedrine alkaloids. They basically said the risks outweighed any potential benefits.
Makes sense. It's like a classic case of something that has legitimate medical uses being exploited for profit without any regard for safety.
A cautionary tale for sure. It really highlights how important it is to understand the whole picture when it comes to any medication or supplement. Don't just buy into the hype.
Right. Do your research.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the legal status of ephedrine. I know you mentioned it's regulated by the FDA, but what does that mean practically speaking?
So in the U.S., ephedrine is classified as a Schedule IV controlled substance.
Okay. And what does Schedule 4 mean exactly?
It means it has a moderate potential for abuse and dependence. You can only get it with a prescription from a licensed medical professional.
So no buying it over the counter or online?
Nope, not legally anyway. And it's important to remember that the legal status of ephedrine can be different in other countries.
Oh, well, so what's allowed here might be totally banned somewhere else.
Exactly. Always got to be aware of the laws wherever you are, especially if you're traveling with any medications.
Good point. So for someone who is prescribed ephedrine, are there any practical tips they should keep in mind, like dosage or storage?
Absolutely. First and foremost, always follow your doctor's instructions about how much to take and how often. Never take more than what's prescribed.
No doubling up if you miss a dose, or figuring more is better.
Nope. And it's super important to store ephedrine properly. Keep it in a cool, dry place away from light and moisture.
Basic medication safety.
Exactly. And of course, always keep medications out of reach of children.
Always good advice. Now, one thing I've always wondered about medications is how long they stay in your system. What about ephedrine?
The effects of ephedrine usually last for several hours, but the drug itself can be detectable in your system for up to 24 hours.
Okay, so something to keep in mind if you have to take drug tests for work or anything.
Right. Always best to be upfront with your healthcare provider and anyone else who needs to know.
Now, I've got to ask this. We all know caffeine is a stimulant. Is it safe to take ephedrine with caffeine?
That's actually a combo that's generally not recommended. Both ephedrine and caffeine are stimulants, so taking them together could really increase the risk of side effects.
Like what kind of side effects?
Things like high blood pressure, anxiety, heart palpitations.
So even if you're feeling tempted by that extra energy boost, it's better to be safe than sorry.
Absolutely. Don't mess with your health for a quick buzz.
It's amazing how much we've learned about ephedrine. It's a whole lot more complex than I initially thought.
It really shows you the intricacies of pharmacology and how much ongoing research there is constantly trying to understand how drugs affect us.
It's pretty wild, right? We started with this seemingly simple plant, and now we're talking about the nervous system, heart problems, even the FDA getting involved.
It's a good reminder that natural doesn't always equal safe. And even substances with beneficial uses can have a dark side.
Absolutely. Knowing all this about ephedrine, its potential for good and bad, it makes you think about all the medications we encounter, even the everyday stuff.
It really does. Makes you realize we shouldn't take any medication for granted, whether it needs a prescription or not. There's always that risk-benefit balance to consider, even with over-the-counter meds.
So true. It's easy to just assume that if something's readily available, it must be harmless. But ephedrine's story shows us that's not always the case.
Definitely. You've got to understand the potential effects, good and bad, before you put anything in your body. And if there's one thing I hope listeners take away from this, it's the importance of talking to their healthcare provider.
Yeah, asking questions, getting the facts.
Hmm.
Our health is too important to just rely on Dr. Google.
Exactly. Sometimes the simplest questions can make a huge difference.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive into Ephedrine Day, a journey through history, science, and really the constantly changing world of medicine. And huge thanks to you for sharing your expertise and helping us make sense of it all.
It's been my pleasure. Always enjoy getting to explore these topics in depth.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative. If you're interested in more topics like this, you can visit our website, publichealthlaw.net. And until next time, stay curious.